Hello and welcome to GuyLogic. My name is Temco and this is Tyranny, Obsidian Entertainment's newest CRPG, a bit like in the vein of Baldur's Gate or Planescape Torment or games like that. And they have found new wings under the publisher of Paradox Interactive, so let's see what those two have cooked up in this RPG. Now, Tyranny takes a little bit of a different approach to the RPG journey genre, with evil having won and you being an actual lackey of the evil overlord. With lots of branching stories and a very large extensive campaign, this review is about 30 hours in, and I've not even scratched the surface of all the various details and nuances that I've noticed in various changing dialogue options and branching storylines. So this game is vast, it is large, it's a lot of reading, it's a lot of backstory, it's a lot of world building, it's a lot of character development, it's just a lot of RPG in here. But before we dive into the gameplay proper, let's take a look at the options menu. As always, you can skip straight on ahead to the gameplay section if you are not so inclined. Options-wise, we start with the game options, where the game has a couple of languages. Next up come the ability to show reputation during dialogue. Now this is a fairly important one, because this allows you to either disable the dialogue option that says +2 loyalty, -1 rage, and so on during dialogue moments, and this provides a little bit more of an organic way of playing the game instead of being more driven on numbers and resources. So turning this off may give you a little bit more immersion. And the same really goes for most of these changes in this menu. The one thing I would add is the loot radius. I would put this up a little bit higher just so you have a little bit bigger of a range for the loot, because there really is no reason to go from corpse to loot. And the same goes for the various other things in the game. Just put them as you deem fit. If we head over to difficulty, you'll notice that this doesn't have a difficulty setting. Now there is a difficulty setting you do select when you load up the game. It's 4 modes and it's fairly complete. In fact, the normal difficulty in the game is probably a little bit on the easy side, and I would crank it up quite a bit. But besides that, you have quite a bit of extra option here to change things around, including the ability to add permadeath to you or your companions, which is fairly impressive. This means the companions, once they die a couple of times, can no longer be resurrected, and that does impact your gameplay quite a bit, so do use this with care. And then you have some other options like showing interactions during dialogue you don't have access to because you don't meet the requirements, either backstory-wise or stat-wise. And some other things like leveling up your companions, displaying tutorials, displaying the qualifiers you need for an option to be unlocked so you can maybe come back later, and stuff like that. So this just changes a little bit of the dialogue and the way information is presented to you, so you can make your own decision how immersed you want to be in the story and RPG elements versus playing more of a computer game and going by the numbers. Then we have the auto pause function, which is one I really like. Now you can say that you set it to all and it auto pauses on all these moments. I would really suggest you do not do that, because there is a ton of these that just doesn't need a pause at any given time. Myself, I've changed some pauses to either combat start, and that also stops party movement, which is fairly useful, and when you spot an enemy, which I don't put an end to party movement, I just want to orient myself, and then when I find a hidden object or things like a trap and stuff like that. So overall, some fairly low-end stuff with auto pause. I just do everything real time, but the base bar just puts the game on pause anyway, so you can always do that whenever you deem fit. And the ability to change this is fairly good, because again, it customizes your ability to change around the game, which is fairly good. And that really is the name of the game so far: customization, decision making, and choices. If you head over to controls, you see fully rebindable keyboard and mouse key bindings set apart in the various methods, screens, and group party options. Overall, the default bindings are fairly decent, but I would suggest just trying them out left and right to see which ones you use most. Whether there's certain abilities you use a lot and you want to hotkey those to that, whether there's certain other things you might want to get access to. Couple of things like that. You might want to change around a few here. For example, spell creation on P is a bit annoying for me, etc. So you can change around things here, but the defaults aren't bad. Then just before the end, we end up at graphics, and the game doesn't have a lot of graphical options, obviously being a isometric pseudo top-down game. And the game looks absolutely stunning, but there are some things you can turn on or off. First things, there is cage cursor, which allows the cursor to be stuck to the game window, which is basically locked to window. My personal favorite, Bugbear, is also in the game in a positive way because they have a colorblind mode. Now, there is no selection for colorblind mode as we saw in Titanfall, but we can't really complain too much. They did add a colorblind mode. And then this allows the option to use gibs, which is the effects that an enemy is killed, which is very gruesome and explodey and fairly graphic, so you might want to turn that off if you are so inclined. And then there's a couple of other things here that you can turn on or off. Then we have some fun scaling, anti-aliasing, and frame rate capping if you are so inclined. Honestly, there is no reason to cap your frame rate. It doesn't impact anything. The game runs absolutely fine at any setting. And the game does not work well with Fraps or DxStory, which is the two programs I generally use to record YouTube videos. The game's performance in this regard isn't bad at all. On max settings, which is limited, the game still performs at a stable 60 plus FPS at any situation. But sadly, when you turn on Fraps or another recording software, it does dip quite a bit lower on that regard. So it's not a gameplay performance thing, it's an issue with the recording software. So any stuttering you might see in the video is due to that and not due to the game itself. Then we end up with sound, which has 4 sliders for master, music, effects, and voice volume. I would honestly put voice volume higher than most of the others. Now my own personal voice and volume setup is a little bit weird on my PC because I use 2 different ways of managing my audio sound, so my volume is always a little bit on a very low end. You might want to change that around for your own preference. So that brings us to the end of the option menu. Overall, Tyranny provides a massively interesting way of customizing your gameplay and customizing the controls for your gameplay. It allows a decent number of controls in regards to graphical fidelity, as well as preferences in terms of full screen, windowed, and colorblind mode. No complaints at all. And on top of that, the performance is rock solid, and again, no issues at all. From a CRPG perspective and from a PC build perspective, this game is phenomenally put together and has all the bells and whistles you might desire. Now, if we head over into New Game, you'll notice there's a couple of difficulty settings, as well as an Expert mode and Trial of Iron. I do not suggest trying out Trial of Iron on your first try, but I would suggest going into Hard or even Path of the Damned difficulty, even on your first playthrough, at least if you are familiar with this kind of game. So things like Planescape Torment, things like Divinity Original Sin, games like that, I would suggest going on Hard or Path of the Damned, because even if the early game is a little bit challenging, even in normal mode, that fully falls to the fall as soon as you reach the middle of the campaign or so, when you start racking up abilities, team abilities, and items left and right, and you start bashing through enemies without having to even worry about using consumables, which is a bit of a downside of playing on normal difficulty. So I do suggest playing it on a higher difficulty. Expert mode is fairly hard. Again, it is aimed at the more legacy style player that enjoys a more immersive or old school experience, because it disables lots of helper features that would allow you normally to either highlight items or see secrets or look at levers and stuff like that in the game. With Expert mode, that is disabled, and you'll spend a lot more time clicking around and looking for that lever to open that gate, to open that chest, to find that secret. And the Trial of Iron, well, only one save file, permadeath, and that is it. If you make a decision and that is wrong, or if you make a decision and want to try a different one, Trial of Iron is not for you. I would do suggest checking out a couple of these because, especially in the early game, you can get a good feel for what is best for your experience. So that is that. So what I'm going to do is load up the game where I left off in the campaign and show you a little bit of gameplay and talk about all the various features in the game. So what you're looking at is gameplay about 25 to 30 hours into the campaign, and I have my party and we're going into an area where we'll be killing a couple of dudes and looting a bunch of stuff. This does contain minor story spoilers, so depending on the choices you make, and that is the first thing I want to talk about in the game. Before we talk about graphics and before we talk about RPG elements and stuff like that, I first want to talk about the way they designed and built the story aspect and the way you make decisions in the interface. Because part of the classical RPG aspect is lots of dialogue with lots of choices you make that have both positive and negative consequences. And in this game, that is the core idea of the entire game. Every step of the way, you'll be making decisions. Not per se decisions in dialogue, but also decisions in terms of which option you take for killing enemies, or which option you take for helping allies, or thwarting allies, or creating enemies, including options you take in regards to which companions you have in your party when you go into certain dialogues, and options you take into which pre-selection you do when you start up the game, in a sort of mini select your own adventure mode where you build up your character's pedigree. Every aspect of this game is around choices, and some of these choices are pure choices in regards to which one would you prefer. Do you stab the dude, or do you hang the dude? Do you kill the peasants, or do you enslave the peasants? Some of the other choices are more linked to your backstory. What class are you? What history did you go? Are you a war mage? Are you a diplomat? Did you get raised in the capital under Kyrios' rule? Or are you a peasant of the outskirts that has never set foot in a capital city? All these things open different dialogue trees. Coupled with the various abilities and stats you have in the game, you then create a method where you also have options in gods. For example, your lore skill, where you can know a lot about things from history or from different regions, or your subterfuge, which is more like bluffing and lying and stuff like that, where you get to know more about just cheating a character out of things. And then you also obviously have things like actually bluffing in the game and all these other things you have to make dialogue choices. But that's not the only choices you make in terms of dialogue or actions you take. Even the methods you do to complete quests, such as helping one ally over another, do shape the story to a massive extent. Helping one faction of the armies you are aligned with over another can result in massive differences in between those armies, up to one of those armies swearing vengeance and creating a much harder gameplay experience for you down the line as they ally with previous enemies. There's also far-reaching consequences to certain actions or items or even objects you may have on your person or on your characters that you would not even think of otherwise. Now, there's some things that are obviously set in stone. Eventually, you'll get to a point where you need to complete certain quests just to progress the story. And some of these are fairly logical and don't really allow divergence. But the way you get to these and the way they are traded to you is fairly impressive. One option you'll have fairly early on in the game is deciding whether or not one army or another army is allowed to destroy a city. One army says, we'll kill all of them and enslave those that run, and the other army says, no, we'll just kill as many as we can, and then we're gonna enforce the others to fight for us in a sort of conscription basis. And the choice between these two changes results in that one of these armies, based on which one you sent in, might have more or fewer soldiers in certain skirmishes down the line. So it's not only choices that affect you, but they also affect the game world and the characters available in that world. Up to NPCs not being able to talk to you or not even being alive to talk to you, depending on certain choices you make that may not even appear to impact this other aspect. And that is fairly phenomenal and really, really good. From that regard, I want to move into the way the story is told and the way you evolve on things. Because there are some things here that are fairly great and some things that leave me a little bit confused. Because the game is all about being an RPG and following a story, you're progressing into an ever-reaching aspect of the world. The problem is that the game doesn't make it apparent where you're reaching to. And while on one end this is fairly cool because you're left guessing as to what is happening and what might come after, and the dialogue changes in there, and those twists and turns create a much more immersive gameplay experience, from a pure power gamer experience or from a stat-based experience, building your character in a certain direction with abilities or stats or skills that might not be useful or might be effectively very bad for you or your party later down the line, might not be as fun for everyone. It all depends on how much you enjoy exploring and experiencing an RPG versus getting the best experience out of playing the game as best you can. So that is a bit of a twist depending on whether or not you are a power gamer in essence. But the way they tell all of that is damn good, no complaints here at all. The various ways dialogue is set up, the various ways cutscenes are set up, the various ways pseudo cutscenes are set up, everything fits tremendously well with the game, and there's no complaints here at all. And can I mention that the audio for this game, from voice acting to music to combat to game sounds, is so well put together. It all feels great. In a certain moment, you'll be running through a dust storm, and you can hear the way the dust clangs off the armor and all this swishing and shooing of your people going through that dust storm. And when there's dialogue, you can even hear the way they talk, like if they have a rasp in their voice from being stuck so long in this dust storm that is ever petulantly not going away. Everything from the tiniest of details has been put together with so much care and attention, and it oozes personality due to it. I really can find no fault in this regard. But there is a fault I can find in the way graphics are presented in certain ways. This mostly comes forward when you have a very dark area inside a dungeon. It appears as if the gamma balance really isn't up to par. If you're looking at the daylight or nighttime cycles in the game, which are available and do cycle around and actually have a gameplay purpose outside of visuals, the game's visuals, when it's really light outside, appear too bright in certain scenarios, especially in desert settings or near water. And when you're in a dungeon, depending on the lighting in the dungeon, it appears often to be the case that this area is way too dark. In one particular scenario, I spent over 20 minutes looking for a puzzle piece I missed in a puzzle during a dungeon because I couldn't find the door I was looking for to go through. And I was literally standing next to that door, and it should have been clearly visible from my visual perspective, but I couldn't see it visually. And I actually turned up my monitor's gamma for that, and then it was clearly apparent. I don't recommend doing that. Obviously, it's not the best way, but I do suggest they fix that in some fashion. And that is really the only downside I have, or the only negative thing I have to say about the way the game looks or sounds like. Overall, a phenomenal audio and visual quality, as well as very, very awesome presentation and art style. Now, moving away from that, let's talk a little bit about how combat works and the way your characters and skills work. Because again, the way they have decided that everything fits together in terms of decision making also accounts for your characters and their skills. And when I say characters, I do mean characters. Your own main character is sort of a magnet for these various characters. And unlike many other games where you obviously have your main character, that is you, and then you have a bunch of characters you interchange as you deem fit based on your own personal preferences or maybe their set abilities. Here, all of those characters have combined abilities with your main character. A mage character, for example, has an ability that you throw a rock in the air and then she explodes that rock, shelling everyone with debris and fragments. And this is only one ability out of quite a few that combines you and your party members. And this ability type, as well as various other abilities, are unlocked through dialogue, through actions, through combat, through questing, through items, through various other modes where you gain renown, gain favor, and gain either loyalty, wrath, favor, or fear from the various factions and people. And you can gain these at the same time. So somebody could be very loyal and also be very afraid of you at the same time. And you'll get actions on both sides of the fence. Obviously, most of these are unlocked through the dialogue system, and some are unlocked through various actions, such as deciding to save a peasant or execute him, depending on who you have in your party, or even sometimes on inaction. Not interfering with certain things are happening on screen when you can might also result in this. Again, the way they tell the story and the way your actions matter also translate in the way you get abilities and the way characters use those abilities in combat as well. Fairly good. Now, the way these abilities work in combat is that the combat is a real-time system, which basically boils down to every ability having a global cooldown. So basic attacks have a shorter one, and then your special attacks have a longer one, and you have to queue these up for them to work. And the same applies for spells that have both an internal cooldown as well as a global cooldown that cycles through the entire thing. Again, based on what you decide to do in terms of dialogue, in terms of questing, you get different abilities, and the different abilities can be combined either with your main character as well as a side character or a companion, and you also have abilities you unlock that are passive that apply to the entire party, or abilities specific characters unlock that are passive that apply to the entire party, or this is quite layered on top of each other, and that is fairly cool again. Now, combat is real time, as I said, and the way you can manage that for all those characters is you have an active pause button. You just press the spacebar, everything stops, and you can take a look at things and just decide which actions you want to take. One minor thing that annoyed me initially about the combat system, but I've grown kind of fond of during the gameplay, is that collisions are available in the game. That means if you have two characters standing in front, you can't pass your other two characters through them, you have to go around. And if you're in a tiny corridor or on top of a bridge or in a ravine, this might not be possible. This means that the formations, which you have full control over, are actually fairly important to make sure that the characters you want up front are actually up front, and the characters you want in the rear are in the rear. And if you get attacked from behind, well, you should not have done that. So there is some level of tactical gameplay here in positioning, as well as ability selection, as well as composition, and that is fairly cool. Now, each character has a bunch of abilities, outside of the ones unlocked during the various loyalty and fear aspects during questing. You have abilities you unlock during leveling, and you can put these in various trees for each character. A fighter is going to have abilities that allow him to shield your allies better. The mage is going to have abilities that allow him to either heal people better or deal better damage. The rogue archer is going to have abilities designed around stealth and ranged combat, and so on and so forth. This is fairly par for the course for most RPGs, nothing really too strange in here, except that some of these abilities aren't directly designed around combat, some of them are also designed around exploration, dialogue, and other things like that. The second part is your stats system that also ties into the different set of skills. Now you have your abilities, as I said, that you unlock and that you can level up, but you also have skills. These skills are things like dodge, lore, parry, one-handed weapons, two-handed weapons, unarmed combat, and so on and so forth. And this allows you to level up a set of 6 stats, such as endurance, or things like that, and then from there gain skills in those supporting stats. And that is fairly cool because it allows you both to train those skills separately, either by using them, such as using a 200 weapon will train your 200 weapon skill, but also by upgrading things like your endurance and renown and strength to increase the ability you have with that kind of weapon. You can also talk to trainers and various NPCs in the game world that will train you for a nominal fee up to a certain degree. And that is fairly cool if you're at the start of the game and you're trying to figure out what might work for your character or what you might enjoy playing. And that allows you a little bit of flexibility when you're initially fleshing out your character. Now what the game doesn't offer is a way to reset your stats and redesign your character. And that is a bit of a shame, because there's no real reason in a single player game, or even in a multiplayer game in my opinion, not to have the ability to reset your character stats and just redistribute them from the get-go. And quite a few games have implemented these methods to allow more player flexibility. If you're playing a two-handed sword wielder like I am, and halfway through the campaign, you decide you'd prefer to be a dual wielder because you see all these cool dual wield abilities you didn't know beforehand when you started your character, you're kind of penalized not to do that by not having that ability. And that is a bit of a shame. Not the greatest thing, because there's quite a few things here you can distribute in and change around in, and you can still do quite a few things in regards to changing your character, but it's not perfect. Outside of those two things, combat is fairly good and fairly well put together. There's a variety of abilities from stuns to roots to knockdowns to knockbacks. There's a variety of abilities both mundane, such as fire arrows or big cleaving sundering hits. There's some magical abilities that allow you to cast wide area spells, healing spells, resurrection spells, the entire gamut of all the various abilities you are known and are familiar with from every RPG, from Dragon Age to Baldur's Gate to Neverwinter Nights to every other thing is basically available, and that's a fairly good thing. They don't really deviate too far from the path in terms of what is available. Where they do deviate quite a bit from the path is the way they do magic, and that is again a really cool system, but it is quite confusing to get a hang of. So I would have liked to have way more explanation and way more introduction to this system as opposed to it being sort of dropped on your lap as it is currently. It's not a bad system by any means, but it took me a good 10 or 15 hours into the game before I finally figured out the way it was supposed to work. And that is a damn shame. Now the way the system works is you combine different runes. You select a core rune, which is a certain specific squiggle. Then you add a amending rune, which says this is short range, long range, or AoE. And then on top of that, you can add multiple modifiers to that rune, which means that these modifiers, for example, say, okay, this is going to be longer lasting, this is going to be longer range, this is going to have a stronger effect or reduce cooldown. And each addendum you add to a rune makes it a unique spell. And to cast spells, you need a certain skill level in casting these spells. And only characters that have a high enough skill level can cast these spells. So you could make a very simple spell, say a very simple heal spell, that any minor mage character you have could cast. But it wouldn't be particularly great. It would probably be short range and only heal for a particularly low amount of health. But if you have a mage character with a larger ability to cast spells, you could probably make a much stronger heal spell in short range, or you could decide to make that short range spell a long range spell and heal from a distance, or even heal in an AoE radius. And the way you combine these things, and you can unlock all these various glyphs and augments to these glyphs for your spells during gameplay and during questing and mostly during exploration, is damn good. But the way the system is explained and introduced is very confusing, and I would really like the developers to spend some more time introducing a little bit better. Another note that is fairly as expected, but also again very badly explained and a bit of a mess, is the inventory system. Now there's nothing wrong per se in the inventory system. A character has 4 slots for armor, 2 slots for various trinkets, and then it has 2 or 3 or 4 slots for weapons and a couple of quick slots for items. And you can unlock more slots based on skills and abilities and dialogue options for a variety of the weapon and quick slots items. Then your character has their own personal inventory, and then you have a global party inventory. All of that pretty mundane and pretty self-explanatory. But there's no way to search in the inventory, there's no way to highlight specific types of items. If I'm trying to get my dual-wielding fighter a new weapon and I open my party inventory, I can only sort by all weapons, and then good luck finding out if this weapon is better, except going through all of them one by one by one by one. fairly annoying and very involved process. Also, the numbers don't really mean that much. What is 0.012 on my DPS? I mean, yes, I understand the raw number there, but what does it translate to? Why would I need to upgrade for 0.012? And the same goes for the way tooltips are, that certain magical items have augments that they say for, well, this item heals you every second, it's regenerating. This item gives you plus 10 on your lore check, and stuff like that. But that doesn't explain those stats and those augments in the tooltip window. You have to right click on an item and read the extended window, which slows down the process even further. Lastly, the various armors and armor types are again badly explained. In many games, mages are restricted to cloth or very light armor, if any armor at all. And I'm not sure if that is the same case for Tyranny, because the game never tells me, and any attempt I've made at casting spells or casting abilities hasn't really shown any inclination that this is the case. I've had mages in bronze, I've had mages in iron, I've had mages in cloth, I've had them in leather, and they've been casting the same spells left and right regardless. Was there a negative modifier? Maybe, but the game never told me. And that is a fairly annoying part of Tyranny. It's probably the game's weakest aspect is the inventory and loot management, because you do get a lot of loot, but most of the time they are all fairly low level upgrades, very minor in and of themselves, and not really that inspired. There is no cool armor that I found. There's a couple of cool items, but they are very rare, and you basically drown in useless crap before you get to that point. Now, you can obviously sell this stuff to vendors, and you should, and the inventory space is large enough that, getting a clogged and full inventory is never really an issue. So in that regard, the game does an okay job. But the fact that I have to spend 10-15 minutes after every legal map I clear of enemies, figuring out if there's any armor I want to upgrade based on the +1 armor I get, but the -1 frost armor I get, the plus 0.01 I get on my recovery rating, and the -1 I get on my deflection. Does that translate to anything? Is that a net positive? Is that a net negative? I feel less like I am figuring out whether or not this piece of armor is cool and I should use it, versus I'm trying to run a math course figuring out whether or not I want to spec to optimize for this rating counter in World of Warcraft. Not exactly great. Another note is the various consumables. I have yet to find a large use for many of them in many scenarios. They are very niche and very restricted to what they should be used for, things like +1 renown, or immunity to bleed attacks. And because you generally don't know ahead of time when a certain something might provide a bleed attack, or might provide a frost attack, unless you've encountered that enemy type specifically beforehand, you do end up in a scenario where you have a ton of consumables you never actually use. And that is again a bit of a shame, and is mostly translated to the weaker inventory management system, that you don't have the idea. You might say, oh, did I have an item for poison resistance? Oh, it doesn't matter. I'll just force my healing through it, and that's gonna be that. A bit of a letdown in that regard. So moving away from that, let's talk a little bit overall about the way the game as a whole feels. As I said earlier, performance is pretty damn good. I also said combat is pretty damn good. Inventory, pretty weak. Graphically, pretty damn good. In the scale of RPGs, this game has a tremendous amount of twists and turns that allows you to create your own story. And I will probably be playing this game 2 or 3 times through just to get the different perspectives and different ideas the way a story is untold. The world Obsidian has built here is phenomenal, and the various little subterfuges and various little bits of information you get during the story hint at something more. Now, whether or not this more is explored during the campaign, or explored if you picked other choices early on in the campaign, that I don't know, because, quite frankly, the game is humongous, and even 30 hours in, I'm nowhere near the end. You also unlock your own spire, which is sort of your castle, which you can upgrade with a bunch of stuff and get cool loot that way. You also have messages and missives you can send back and forth to your boss. You have to report to that boss as well. You have a bunch of various reputations you have to manage and deal with, and all of this combined provides an enormous amount of content across the entire game. The way the story ramps up from the start is a little bit strange, because initially when I start the game and when I loaded into the game, it said, oh no, you only have like 8 days to complete this quest, and I had a feel of like I was playing Zelda Majora's Mask. Oh no, 3 days until the end of the world, where most of the time, if you want to go off the beaten track, you are forced to decide whether or not it was worth traversing everything all over again just to get a rollback on the time to get this one little extra item on the side. Thankfully, in the case of Tyranny, this is not a lasting thing, and the game opens up substantially after the first segment of the game, where it sort of sets the stage for the rest of the story. And once you open up the map, and once you start getting into more segments of the map, the game is still fairly contained. It's a very directed experience. So it's not like things like Baldur's Gate where you are set free in the world and it says go ahead, explore, you see what you deal with, and if you stumble into a level 35 area and die, well, that's on you. The game is a very directed experience that slowly opens up the game based on where you left off, bit by bit, piece by piece. So it's not an open world, it's not open exploration, it is a very directed, story-driven experience, but the way it's put together gives you the idea and the immersion of a very broad world where you are sort of running back and forth at the beck and call of your evil overlords. A truly good design for a game that makes itself appear to be much larger than it is. And don't get me wrong, the game is pretty huge in all regards. Now there's one other minor issue I'd like to mention, and that is the way the interface is put together. There are certain things that annoy me about the way tooltips, the way debuffs, the way actions, the way health, all these things are displayed, where the game has massive bonus points in displaying dialogue options and giving you a full slew of information in what is available. It does a 180 on the available information during combat. A character that has a buff can only be seen through the detail window of that character. There is no way to do that in an overview or a global window. If a character, for example, is stunned or delayed, you do get a little icon above the character, but it disappears much faster than the actual stun. If a character is frightened and tries to run away, they will still perform or try to perform their cued actions but not be able to do them, and there's all these weird little inconsistencies in regards to that. There's some cool stuff like the minimap morphing into a combat log, but some also very annoying stuff like all the various passive modifiers you gain eventually from all the various buffs you unlock, clogging up your screen and all having cooldown timers that just recycle every time, making a very cluttered experience overall. I'm not a great fan of the way the combat UI works. It works great out of combat with a large overview of information and very clear view at the visuals with little clutter, but once you get into the combat, that idea of very little clutter results in you needing to go through various screens and windows and menus and pause buttons, prolonging combat much longer than you would need to if you were just going forward on trying to figure out why your character is stunned, or if you're trying to cast a heal spell on a character and trying to figure out whether or not that character actually needs that very, very strong heal spell, or if they can manage with a minor heal spell for the moment. And pressing pause and doing all these actions is a little bit annoying because it does break the flow of combat in a real-time combat system. So overall, Tyranny is a tremendously well put together RPG. It has a large, spanning story, epic vistas, an amazing world, some awesome world building, great writing, decently good voice acting for the most part. I have very little to complain about except for the things I mentioned. And if you are interested in games like this, games like Baldur's Gate, games like Planescape Torment, games like Divinity Original Sin, I do definitely suggest you check out Tyranny when it comes out on November the 10th on Steam for 41 euros or your regional equivalent. And if you like this video, press the like button below. If you didn't like this video, there's a dislike button for exactly that purpose. And leave a comment. Tell us what you liked. Tell us what you didn't like. We want to hear back from all of you. And if you want to see more content like this on the channel, just press that subscribe button down below and we will deliver. And until then, I wish you a good day, and until next time, right here on GuyLogic.